and it was a few months back that I was at that other place. I don't know how much the rivalry runs, how much I'm allowed to mention the other place, but I was at the other place. But it's interesting, I was talking to a man on the train on the way down, and he said, oh, Canterbury's lovely, you know, the centre of town is absolutely glorious, and you've really got to go and visit this and that. And I said, oh yes, politely as you do, while thinking, well, I know this meeting room and that meeting room and another meeting room. And that's my knowledge of very large parts of Britain. It's different meeting rooms. You've got a very nice class of meeting room here, I have to say. And I very much enjoyed, I'm pleased to see that many of the people I was talking to in the previous hour about politics here again. I'll try not to repeat myself too much. And I have to say that I've had a fairly busy day. I actually started off with BBC Radio Scotland talking about competition in sport. And then I went to the Daily Politics with Nadine Dorris to talk about Tory energy policy. And the standard of debate that I had this afternoon in the last hour was far, far higher than anything else I've enjoyed today. So thank you very much. And so I thought I'd start off with a couple of things that are happening today that you might or might not have seen, depending on how much you've been following all the social media stuff. And one of the things that happened today was speaking to the Federation of Small Business. David Cameron said, and I quote, "I really don't like taxes." And I think that's a very interesting statement. This, of course, is from the Prime Minister who, almost exactly a year ago, stood there on the steps of Davos and promised to lead a global crusade against aggressive tax avoidance. He was going to make all those multinational companies pay their taxes. Now he tells us he doesn't like people paying taxes at all. And I think we really have to follow the logic of that through. Because if you don't like taxes, you don't like schools and hospitals and roads and police and all of those things that our taxes pay for. Because it's through paying taxes that we get all of those services, that we both provide the essential structures of our society, but we also ensure that there's a safety net there for people who need it. And that, of course, could be any of us, because unless you're in what Occupy calls the 1%, all of us are only one accident, one medical incident, one bout of your company that you work for going broke, away from needing the help of the state. That help of the state that's provided by taxes. Now, one of the other things that's come out of today, and you probably would have been trying really hard to avoid this, is George Osborne is going around proclaiming he's seeing the bright light of recovery. Well, I think actually that bright light that he can see approaching is actually the steam train that's leading an election. He's a bit confused about this. But I think we really need to question what this recovery is, and oddly enough I'm agreeing with Vince Cable on this, which isn't something that happens very often. But what we have is a recovery that's largely built on two things. It's built on lots more money flowing into and out of our financial sector. That's our fraud-ridden, deeply corrupt, utterly unreformed, and still very, very shaky financial sector. And you might recall when this government came into power in 2010 that they were promising they were going to rebalance our economy. You might remember that. But now we have a recovery, so-called, built on the financial sector and built on increased consumer debt. What could possibly go wrong? So I'm going to turn now to the positives, the kind of way of how we actually must rebuild our society. But I'm doing this in the kind of framework that says, actually continuing as we are, going back to somehow like we went back to the start of 2007 before the financial crash, ran a few levers a bit differently, made a few settings a bit different, and then just steamed on. That will not happen. Business as usual is not an option. We have to radically change our society. So the question we have to ask is, how do we radically change our society? And I think we need to start by saying, what are some of the biggest things that we need to change? And if you look at the fact that here in Britain, this very wealthy overall country, that 20% of workers, 1 in 10, is on less than a living wage. Now it's worth pulling out the figures of this and thinking about what that means. A living wage is worked out each year on the basis of the basic minimum you need to put a roof over your head, to put food on the table, to get 1 week's holiday in Britain over the whole year. It's a basic, very simple standard. And 20% of workers are paid less than that in their work. And what we saw, and that's not actually a new situation, that's not a post-financial crash situation. This is a product also of the previous Labour government, which was content to allow the value of the minimum wage to fall and to allow government payments to come in to fill the gap, mainly housing benefit and family tax credit. And so what they were doing was allowing the level of wages to fall and topping it up so people could live. But what it is really, is actually corporate welfare. Because although it mightn't be on when you go out applying for jobs, it mightn't be written in the job description to say you will keep living, but it's kind of assumed as a basic standard of an employee, they will keep living. They'll keep having showers, they'll keep feeding themselves, they'll have a roof over their head and won't be sleeping on the grating outside the shop before they go and work at the shop. And yet we have companies, often very large companies, that are paying workers significantly below the level that they actually need to survive. And I think if you want to take a really concrete example of this, the GMB Union did a very good study back in March of Next, the clothing chain, to look at all of the jobs. They'd advertised hundreds and hundreds of jobs in March. Isn't it great, all of this job creation? Might be built on consumer debt, but hey, job creation's a good thing. 97% of those jobs were minimum wage or within pennies of minimum wage. And 97% of them were 12.5-hour-a-week contracts or less. These are not jobs that you can build a life on, jobs you can live on. And there's one magic extra factor that when you multiply those two figures together, the fact is that that is below the national insurance minimum. So Next isn't having to pay national insurance for all of those workers. And that's not the kind of economy, not the kind of society that we can actually continue to live in. This isn't long-term sustainable. And of course, what's filling in the gaps? One of the things that's filling in the gaps is food banks. I actually visited with Keith Taylor, our South East MEP, last week, Winchester. Now Winchester is a pretty wealthy kind of place. You look at it, it looks very nice on the high street. Lousy traffic problem, but that's another story. But Winchester, this wealthy place, we went and visited the food bank there. And that food bank they were celebrating their 10th birthday, they had a birthday cake and everything. But they were telling me, the volunteers there were telling me how bittersweet it was, because when they started up 10 years ago, they were mostly helping the really vulnerable people in society who traditionally went to food banks. The women who were victims of domestic violence, who were fleeing the home with nothing. The people who'd just come out of prison. The people with addiction problems. The people who clearly had circumstances that had created their need. What they're helping now, and they said more and more every week, is they're helping young families in which one or both adults work, but they still can't put food on the table. And that isn't that kind of model, the low-wage economy, the casualised jobs, the jobs that aren't full-time, and that you've got no hope of turning into full-time jobs. That's not long-term sustainable. If we kind of do a thought experiment and imagine a society that's built entirely on what I'm going to call Next-style jobs, and I'm not particularly picking on Next, there's lots of other companies that run in similar ways, but if you have a society that's all running on minimum wage, all running on casualised work, on the dreadful 0 hours contracts which we'd like to ban, who's actually going to buy anything? Who's going to have the money to actually keep the economy ticking over? This isn't a model that can continue. Now, of course, that's the kind of economic side of things. And if we think a bit more about the economy, in Britain, about 40% of our food is imported. But if we drill down on that figure a little, there's an even more telling statistics, which is 93% of the fruit that we eat is imported. This is a Britain that used to be famous, indeed this very part of the world was very famous for its apple and pear orchards. British strawberries They're the ones that actually taste like something. British strawberries, we used to have lots and lots of those in season. And yet, what we've done is stopped growing those things and imported it. All too often, of course, flying it in from beans from Kenya, peas from Peru, all of that sort of thing, which is obviously environmentally unsustainable. But also, what we're doing is meaning that we don't have a genuinely secure food supply. And that's not just a point about transport, that's a point about food security and affordability. Because what happened a couple of years ago was that the pound became dropped in value about 20% against the euro and most other currencies. And when the pound fell, the price of fruit, all that imported fruit, leapt up. And what we saw happen was actually the bottom 20% of people by income, the poorest people, simply stopped eating fruit. They couldn't afford it anymore. And so the kind of things we need to do to start to restructure our society is bring food production back to Britain, securely restore it, ideally nearby, minimum transport miles. You know, ideally the food on your plate should have come from a field yesterday morning, landing on your plate today, just down the road. It also tastes a lot better if you can do it that way. And the other thing we need to do, and this is something David Cameron has just started talking about again, is we need to bring manufacturing back to Britain. Because what we need to do is the shoes on your feet, the jacket on your back, the seats you're sitting on. Very often they'll come from China or Bangladesh or places like that. But what we actually need to do is to have those things made locally, minimum carbon emissions, maximum jobs, maximum business opportunities. And what we need to do is have all of that built around small businesses and cooperatives. Because what you do, if you think about a comparison, a pound bag of apples, if you go into your local Tesco or Sainsbury's or whatever and buy a pound bag of apples here in Canterbury, very likely they'll have come from South Africa to start off with, which is another issue. But you'll go probably through the self-service till, because they'll be pushing you to the self-service till. One staff member overseeing maybe 6 tills. You spend that pound, and maybe, you know, a tiny fraction of a pence of that money stays here in Canterbury. If, however, you go and spend that pound buying a bag of apples in your local greengrocer, then she, well, first of all, you know, she probably does her tax through a local accountant. When she needs a new sign on the frontage, she'll get a local sign writer to do it. Tesco just brings in their national contractor. When she wants to get some new shelves in the shop, she'll employ a local carpenter. And you, hopefully, ideally, at least, she'll be buying the apples locally too. And so then you can start to mention how you have a strong local economy that money goes round and round in. And she's probably not going to employ a member of staff on a next 12.5 hour a week minimum wage contract, because that member of staff will be someone she knows, someone who's a friend, and she'll try as best she can to treat them decently. So that's the kind of different kind of model of economy that I would say that we need to go towards. Now, that's the kind of economic sustainability side. It won't surprise you to know that I'm now going to speak a bit about the environmental sustainability side. Things have moved on a little since I was last in Canterbury, because we've had the latest IPCC report. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has come out, and it's very clear that science now is simply unarguable. The scientific debate is over. There's a debate still very much to be had about what policy steps we take to deal with climate change and to prevent climate change, but that there is no question now that climate change is a reality. And you don't just have to listen to me on this. Obviously, you know, I'm a green, I've got the green label on me. But if we pick a couple of people who aren't really known as being greens, Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, he said after the IPCC report came out, the heat is on, we have to act now. That's the UN Secretary General. And if we go to perhaps someone else even less obvious, Christine Lagarde, the head of the International Monetary Fund. And she was asked in a long, wide-ranging interview, what keeps you awake at night? What's the thing that you really worry about when you haven't just got a whole wedge of papers being shoved in front of you? And she said, I worry that we're not doing enough about climate change. And this is the head of the IMF. And I talked quite a lot about energy policy in the earlier session, so I'm happy to take questions on it, but I won't go into too much detail about it now. But I will make one critically important point, which is when we start to think about domestic policy, we start to think about policy that affects all of us on a day-to-day basis. The fact is, there's only one cheap form of energy, there's only one truly green form of energy, and that's the energy that you don't use. And a lot of the energy that we're using now, we don't actually need to be using. We have the leakiest housing stock in Western Europe. £1 in 4 that we spend on heating our homes goes straight out through a drafty door or window or up through a drafty ceiling. What we need to do is get serious, first of all, about energy conservation. And there's a really excellent program put forward by NGOs like Help the Aged and Child Poverty Action Network. It's called the Energy Bill Revolution. And it's a fully costed proposal put forward by the NGOs, which says you take the money, government money, from carbon taxes, and you use it to super insulate every home in Britain that needs it. That lifts 9 out of 10 people now in fuel poverty out of fuel poverty. That creates up to 200,000 jobs, and it cut carbon emissions. So why is it that we currently have a government with a wildly ineffective Green Deal policy, which is, they've got this great deal for you. You can borrow money at 6 or 7%. The finance companies will be very happy. And you can jump through all these complicated hoops, and then you can get some energy conservation measures. You've got that, and you've got the eco scheme, which is a bit better, but the government's halving the rate of rollout. And that's our entire range of energy conservation policy in Britain at the moment. And so what we have to do is think about ensuring that we start to save energy, and then when we start to think about how to generate it, we need to go for renewables. Renewables because they're proven and known technologies, and as I said to Nadine Dorris earlier today, and it probably won't surprise you to know that she's a real enthusiast for fusion. The currently non-existent technology that's 20 years away, and was 20 years away about 30 years ago, what we need is proven known technologies. And the other rather nice thing about renewables is if you think about the wind, the sun, the tide as a fuel, which is rather what it is in terms of renewable energy generation, we always know what the fuel's going to cost, which is nothing. It's a real no-brainer, really. So we need to transform our energy policy, we need to transform our economy, and we need to transform the way we think about public services. Currently, we have a situation where we have this kind of, you have to call it a religion really. Private sector good, public sector bad. Somehow or other we have wonderful efficiencies in the private sector that means they can run things so much better. Now, anyone who's been on a train recently will know how well that one's worked out. And that's why, as the Green Party, we're leading the fight. Caroline Lucas has a private member's bill now before Parliament that would bring the railways back into public hands. Comes up in March. I rather suggest that you might like to write to your MP and see how they're going to vote on that one. Okay, I know what some of your MPs are like, but give it a go anyway. The fact is, this is actually something that has 74% public support. There's a very good survey conducted by one of the big polling organisations, so you might like to point that out to your MP as well. And what we're seeing is the huge wholesale sneaking privatisation of the NHS that's going on at the moment. We're seeing a wonderful structure that gave us a very cost-effective healthcare system is being utterly dismantled and handed over to the private sector. And that's something we have to say, these are public resources, let's keep and defend our public resources. And since I'm in a university, I do also have to mention that inevitable subject, tuition fees. And I'm going to do, for big dramatic effect, the green policy on tuition fees, which is 0. A big whacking 0. That's what we believe tuition fees should be. Because education is a public good. You getting an education is good for you, but it's also good for everybody in Britain to have more educated people. And what should happen is that we should raise taxes, you know, make some of those multinational companies that David Cameron promised would make pay their taxes, actually make them pay their taxes, make rich individuals pay more, and thus ensure that we can fund the education in our universities without individuals ending up with a huge whacking weight of debt. And I think one of the situations that really hasn't been properly thought through is many of you, I know, particularly those of you just starting out, will be leaving university with something like an average of £55,000 of debt sitting on your shoulders. And the reality of that, I don't think people have really thought through what that's going to mean for generations of people as they would usually think about, you know, maybe settling down, starting a relationship, starting a family, buying a house. If you've got that weight of debt sitting on your shoulder, the impacts are going to be enormous. So that's, you know, just one of the ways in which we've just got to do things utterly differently. Finally, a little bit of politics, and then I'll stop and take questions, because I think dialogue is always more interesting than monologue. You'll probably know, most of you will probably know, that we've got the European elections coming up on the 22nd of May. And one of the magic things about the European elections is that they're proportional representation. So what that means in short terms is every vote counts. And broadly, round about the country, if we get about 1 in 10 of the votes, we'll get a seat in each region. We've already got 2 MEPs. A swing of 1.6% would allow us to treble that to 6 MEPs. And yes, I suppose since I'm standing in the same spot as Nigel Farage, I better talk a little bit about Europe. You'll hear a lot of nonsense talked about the European Union. But if you want to think about what does the European Union do, what it does and is there and can provide is a basic foundation of standards. What the European Union can do is set standards of workers' rights, of environmental standards, of consumer standards. Okay, they didn't do so great on horse meat, but hey, you know, they can keep working on that one. Of human rights standards, a layer of standards that ensures that countries in Europe can't undercut each other. Can't say, well, we're going to slash our wages so that we'll be able to outcompete you, and, you know, we're going to abandon our environmental standards and dump more stuff in the river or in the ocean. And of course, the reality of Europe means all of us can be affected by that. It can set those standards. Now, that's not to say that I'm uncritically in favour of Europe. There's a lot wrong with Europe, and we want to reform Europe. And if you want to know what that means in simple terms, think of what you hear David Cameron saying in terms of reform and turn it 180 degrees. And that'll be what we've called for. Which means we want to defend the workers' rights, the social Europe, which can be a really important underlying foundation of standards. But what we want to do is stop the Europe that currently is in favour of big multinational companies that, you know, provides a real risk, and there's a huge risk in the proposed EU-US free trade deal that could be a real threat to the NHS, real threat to all of our public services. We want to reform Europe so it works for people, and particularly we want to reform Europe in terms of ensuring that the principle of subsidiarity, it's really hard to say principle of subsidiarity with great passion, but what it means is something really important, which is decisions being made by local people, by the people most affected, closest to it, those being the people making the decisions. And there was reference made before to the Green Party localism being an important part of our principles. Well, this is localism, but not as David Cameron recognises it. This is localism that actually returns power to local people, lets them decide things, but also gives them the resources to make it happen. Whereas David Cameron's localism very often means taking away decision-making power and taking away money and taking away resources and then saying, oh, you'll sort it out yourself, no worries. Now, I'm sure most of you, I was actually in Cambridge last night at Trinity College, and Russell Brand came up quite a lot. And the "don't vote because it only encourages them" kind of line came up quite a lot. And I've actually got a simple answer to that one, because I don't think that is the answer. Because we've already tried it. You might recall the Police and Crime Commissioner elections. 85% of people followed the Russell Brand approach even before he'd come out to say it, and stayed away. Only 15% of people voted. There was actually one polling station in Newport where not one single person voted. The staff sat there all day from 7 in the morning till 10 at night, and I do feel very sorry for the staff, and not one single person turned up for the whole time. So we've tried that model, we've tried that approach. And what happened? The Police and Crime Commissioners have taken office. They're spending, on average, each about £1 million a year. They're making decisions that affect justice, that affect people's freedom, that affect the way our policing's run, with a 15% mandate. So not voting doesn't work. So I've got an alternative radical suggestion for you, a new way of doing politics, a way of changing politics. What I'd like to suggest is you vote for the person, the party, or the policies that you believe in, that you most like and respect. And given our first-past-the-post system in British parliamentary and council elections, that is actually a radical suggestion. Because over decades, lots of people have been trained to vote for the party or person they dislike the second most, to stop the people they just really dislike getting in. And that's given us the kind of politics that we have now. And I was talking about how our economics and our environment can't continue. Our politics can't continue the way they are either. So this is my radical suggestion for politics. And you can start by experimenting on this in the European election. Because it's proportional representation, your vote does count. Give it a go then, and then see how it feels, and think about giving it a go in 2015 too. Because what have we got to lose? We need a new kind of politics, we need a new kind of society, we need a new kind of economics. And it's actually in all of our hands as voters to deliver that. Let's go out and give it a go. Thank you.